Titanic Lies by Edwina Longbottom Prologue. The Whisper from the Wreck. The North Atlantic was still. A mirror of black glass stretched to the horizon, moonless, windless, timeless. Only the faint hum of propellers disturbed the silence as Alethea, a state-of-the-art submersible, descended into the void, a bright speck of engineered light swallowed by an ocean that had devoured iron, oak, bone, and truth for over a century.
"Descent holding at 12,420 feet, said Lucian Fraser, his voice clipped through the calm. He was no stranger to the abyss. 36 dives logged over 20 years, from the wrecks of U-boats to forgotten Cold War listening posts. But this dive, this one felt watched. In the cramped space beside him, Evelyn Cross tightened her grip on the support rail. She didn't speak. She rarely did on descent. Not out of fear, she didn't believe in fear. Just reverence. She knew what waited below. Not just rusted steel, not just ghosts, but the buried heartbeat of a lie that had throbbed beneath the waves since 1912.
The bow came into view first, rising from the sediment like a cathedral sunk in shame. The Titanic. At least that's what they still called it. Her name had become legend, immortalized, romanticized, sanitized. But Evelyn knew legends were just fictions that had gone unchallenged too long. Lucian steered Alethea toward a fractured section of the officers' quarters. Their mission, funded privately through Evelyn's dwindling grant money and a half-burned inheritance, was simple on paper. Survey a collapsed chamber using new micro-LiDAR scanning equipment. But Evelyn had a secondary objective, one she hadn't disclosed, one sealed in a 1912 journal hidden in her cabin aboard the research vessel.
If the calculations were correct, the collapse had preserved an internal lockbox wedged beneath a rustical-covered cabinet. Inside, she hoped, was a piece of evidence she had spent 17 years chasing. A whisper from a dead crewman. A final, desperate account. "There," she said suddenly, pointing at the screen. Lucian rotated the floodlight. A glint of metal caught the beam. Not modern, too ornate. A box jammed between split wood and twisted pipework, half covered in iron bloom. "I'll bring in the manipulator," he said. The robotic claw extended, slow and deliberate. Sediment puffed into the water like ancient dust disturbed in a long-forgotten crypt. The box resisted at first, then, with a groan like a dying breath, it came free. Lucian placed it in the sample container. They didn't speak again until they broke surface 4 hours later. Back aboard Narrated, the research vessel pitched gently against the Atlantic swells. Evelyn took the box below deck, hands trembling not from cold, but from the weight of possibility.
It was iron-bound, mid-sized, and lined with what looked like lead insulation. There was no lock, just riveted hinges and a clasp that opened under firm pressure. Inside, a bundle of oilskin, a smaller wooden box, and a book.
Evelyn unwrapped it as if handling scripture. A leather journal, brittle with age, faint initials on the inside cover. EJF Engine Room Attendant 3rd Class. Edwin James Finch.
He wasn't on the final crew manifest, because officially Edwin Finch never boarded the Titanic. Yet here he was, writing from inside the ship as it steamed west into oblivion.
Evelyn read the first page.
April 9th, 1912, Belfast. They were not calling it the Switch, but it's clear as day. This ain't a Titanic. The fittings are wrong, the trim's off. We've spent a week scrubbing down Olympic's nameplates and installing Titanic's brass. They think the lads in steerage won't notice, and most won't. But I see what they were doing. The Olympic's keel groaned different. She ain't right. She flipped ahead, skipping pages smeared with rust and age, until the final entry. April 14th, 1912, aft boiler room 5. We read too low in the water, I told McGraw. Told him we weren't trimmed right. He laughed, said orders were orders. Cargo's heavy, not coal, something else. Sealed crates, no labels. Navy escort watched them load. If you find this, if anyone ever finds this ship wasn't the Titanic. God help the poor souls on board.
Evelyn closed the book. The journal had no conclusion, but she had found her beginning.
A century of lies, half-truths, and polished mythology were about to be challenged by a ghost with ink-stained hands. And Evelyn Cross wasn't going to let the Atlantic keep its secrets any longer. Chapter 1. The Myth of the Unsinkable. It began with a photograph, projected onto a cracking university screen before a lecture hall of only 7 attendees. The image was one the world had seen 1,000 times. The RMS Titanic, bathed in morning light at Southampton, her sleek hull dwarfing the quay, her 4 towering funnels casting proud shadows on the dock. The caption beneath read, "The Unsinkable Ship, April 10th, 1912. Evelyn Cross paused, letting the image settle. She didn't need notes. The words were carved into her memory like names on a cenotaph.
Every child learns this story, she began. The maiden voyage, the iceberg, the tragedy. More than 1,500 lives lost in the dead of night in the icy Atlantic. A singular moment of hubris meets nature. But what if it wasn't so simple?
2 students at the back shifted, their laptops half closed. A middle-aged man in a maritime museum fleece scribbled in a notebook. The others just watched, unsure whether they'd decome to a history lecture or a conspiracy talk. Evelyn clicked forward. Slide 2, a close-up of Titanic's porthole arrangements. Slide 3, the Olympic S, barely distinguishable, unless you knew what to look for.
2 ships, she said, built side by side in Belfast. Olympic, launched in 1910, Titanic, 1911. Nearly identical in every way, but not quite. She moved through the slides. Subtle discrepancies. Aft window frames. Differences in promenade enclosures. Bulkhead placements. She explained, as she had for years, how the Olympic had suffered severe damage in a collision with HMS Hawke in 1911. Damage White Star Line's insurance wouldn't cover. Then she let the silence fall.
You suggesting they switched the ships? It was the only student who spoke. A girl, early 20s, uncertain but intrigued. I'm saying the evidence deserves consideration, Evelyn replied, and that much of what we know about Titanic comes from heavily curated narratives designed to protect powerful interests. The room emptied quickly after. One man shook her hand. The others filed out, eyes glazed. She gathered her notes in silence. No applause, no questions, just the familiar echo of footsteps fading into academic disinterest. It hadn't always been this way. 10 years earlier, Evelyn had lectured to packed theaters. She'd published 2 best-selling books on Edwardian maritime engineering. She'd advised museum exhibitions, appeared on late-night history panels, and consulted for the BBC. Then she'd stumbled across the Finch Journal in a footnote buried in a Belfast public records archive, a misfiled letter from a woman claiming her uncle had survived the Titanic disaster but had hidden in Canada, too afraid to come forward. Curiosity had become obsession, and obsession had cost her everything.
Her office was a windowless corner cubicle 2 floors below ground level. A shared space now, stripped of nameplate and tenure. She unlocked the bottom drawer of her filing cabinet. Inside, a personal archive of Titanic documents, blueprints, eyewitness statements, and modern sonar scans from every deep-sea expedition since 1985. On top sat the journal Edwin Finch Lost Testament. She read from it nightly, as if each pass might reveal a new layer, a missed word, a code.
She didn't believe in ghosts, but Finch's words clung to her like salt on skin.
The sharp rap startled her. She slid the journal away. Lucian Fraser stood in the doorway, still wearing his weather-beaten flight jacket, graying at the temples, built like someone who'd never sat still for long. "You giving that lecture to ghosts again?" "Students," she replied, functionally similar. He stepped in without invitation, closing the door behind him. "I've got clearance," he said. She blinked. "For what?" "For a dive. North Atlantic, late June. Off-grid. Quiet sponsors." Her breath caught. She'd submitted over 30 grant applications in 5 years, all rejected. Her last appeal had included everything sonar overlays, comparative architecture analyses, even unofficial testimonies from former Harland Wolff employees. "What changed?" Lucian smiled. "Someone with more money than sense saw your last podcast. Thinks you're cinematically paranoid. Wants to see if there's anything to it."
2 weeks later, Evelyn boarded Narrated, a converted Norwegian research vessel now flagged under Panama and crewed by people who didn't ask many questions. Lucian showed her the layout. They'd operate a newly commissioned submersible named Alethea, capable of sustained dives up to 13,000 feet, with state-of-the-art manipulators and dual-arm robotic recovery systems. It was more than she could have hoped for.
And yet, it felt like stepping into a confession booth.
On her final night before departure, she visited her father's grave. He had been a shipbuilder, retired from Harland Wolff, one of the last living welders to work on the company's Belfast dry docks. He'd never spoken about the switch theory, but in his final days he'd left her a single note. "Don't trust the manifest. Don't trust the name. It was all he wrote, and it was enough. June 12th, 2025. Alethea dove for the third time. This time, they followed Evelyn's coordinates exactly toward the officer's quarters where Finch had supposedly stashed his journal, and possibly more.
The robotic arm breached a collapsed corridor, visibility low, pressure immense, and then the glint.
The box, sealed, weathered, containing a century's worth of silence. The Titanic was unsinkable. That was the claim. Not by her builders, but by the press. Even today, the myth persists, an unthinking shorthand for tragedy and human arrogance. But the real arrogance, Evelyn believed, was in assuming history told the truth. Because once you peeled back the memorials, the museum plaques, the James Cameron documentaries, what remained was something far more disturbing.
A ship sank. 1,500 people died. But was it the ship we were told? Was that the real Titanic? Or something else?
The bell recovered from the wreck bore an engraving eroded by rust and coral. But with proper imaging, it revealed a number inconsistent with Titanic's parts registry. And deep in the riveted pages of Finch's journal was a sentence that Evelyn now repeated to herself every night like a vow. This ship wasn't the Titanic, and it wasn't an accident. Chapter 2. The Journal. There's something sacred about the handwriting of the dead. The pages smelled faintly of iron and brine, the ink faded but still legible, as if the sea had tried to erase it and failed. The journal of Edwin James Finch rested on Evelyn's lap inside her cabin aboard Narrated, and each word she read felt like a whisper dredged from the silted memories of the deep. She hadn't slept since the recovery.
She ran her fingers over the name on the inside cover again. E.J. Finch, engine room attendant, White Star Line. No record of him on Titanic's final manifest. No birth certificate matching his full name in Southampton or Belfast. No known next of kin. And yet here he was, writing from within the walls of the ship that should not have existed the way he described it. Nogorthgor.
Finch had begun his entries days before the Titanic's supposed maiden voyage, when the ship still sat in the Harland Wolff Yard in Belfast. The early pages were terse notes on pay, on oily boots, on overlong shifts, and the stink of new paint that never dries. But then came the first truly strange entry. April 5th, 1912. They moved us from Dock 4 to Dock 3 with no notice. Told the boys to swap tags on cabins. Carpenters from Olympic were brought in, saying they were correcting trim inconsistencies. We were ordered to paint over brass plaques in the dining saloon. They didn't match Titanic's blueprints. Hell, most of what's in this hull doesn't match. I asked McGraw, the old Irish bastard, with no nose for whiskey but an eye for deceit, and he just said, "Best not ask, Finch."
Evelyn cross-referenced the docks mentioned. Dock 4 had been where Titanic sat. Dock 3 had held the Olympic for urgent repairs. That much was verifiable. But why the swap? Why the secrecy? She turned the page. April 6th. New nameplates arrived. The older ones were scrapped, melted down, and dumped. No ceremony, no press, just lads in overalls burning history with acetylene torches. It's not Titanic they relaunching. It's the same bones as Olympic, but they were giving her a new suit and a funeral march disguised as glory.
Evelyn sat back. She didn't want to believe it. She'd have been trained as a historian, not a theorist. But Finch wasn't poetic. He wasn't cryptic. He was scared and practical, the kind of man who only wrote what he saw. Outside her cabin, the ship swayed gently. Above her, the Atlantic stretched like an indifferent god. Lucien's voice crackled over the comm. "Scan team's ready when you are, Doc. Shall we dive again?" She hesitated, eyes still on the journal.
"Tomorrow," she replied. "There's more I need to read."
The next entries focused on the days before departure. April 8th. Cargo arrived, not crates, vaults. 4 men in Navy coats oversaw the transfer. No White Star officials present. All marked with stenciled codes I've never seen before. No weight labels, not listed on cargo logs, stored in hold 3. They've added extra ballast below, I think to offset them. It's throwing off our waterline, but no one's saying a word. Captain Smith visited the lower decks briefly. First time I'd seen him smile since the launch. He handed off a sealed envelope to the Navy boys. I wasn't supposed to see it, but I did. Envelope was stamped Admiralty not to be opened until arrival. The Admiralty, the British Navy, Official history claimed no naval presence on Titanic, no consignment, no classified cargo. But Evelyn had always found it strange that so many passengers connected to the military, finance, and international shipping conglomerates had booked passage at the last minute. Bankers, defense contractors, political figures. Almost as if the ship was never intended to complete its voyage or was transporting something too valuable to risk exposure.
She flipped several pages forward. The handwriting grew more frantic. April 11th. We've left Queenstown. The mood's wrong. Too many officers walking the halls. I asked Mitchell if he thought we'd reach New York. He laughed, but not kindly. Said we'll reach where they tell us to. We're burning through coal at an unnatural rate. Engines are overworked. Steam pressure fluctuates. They want to break the speed record, I think. But we weren't built for it, or this hull wasn't. Anyway, this isn't Titanic's engine room. I know it. I served aboard her twin, and I can feel the difference. This ship's been wounded before. The bulkheads have memory. Evelyn closed the journal. Her hands trembled. Ornis trembled.
That phrase lingered. The bulkheads have memory. It wasn't just poetic. It was literal. Olympic had suffered damage from its 1911 collision with HMS Hawke, a collision that bent her starboard keel and required extensive repairs. Repairs that were never fully accounted for in Harlan Wolff's official shipyard logs. Yet early submersible scans of the Titanic's wreckage showed damage that many experts assumed came from the iceberg. But what if some of it predated the collision? What if they'd sunk a crippled ship to save the Titanic's unblemished reputation and collect the insurance on a vessel too damaged to repair? Evelyn's mind reeled. She stepped outside the cabin into the cool night air, journal clutched to her chest. Narrated floated alone under a canopy of stars, a small vessel in a sea of secrets. Lucien was up on the bridge, coffee in hand, staring into darkness.
Bad dreams? He asked. No, Evelyn said. Worse. Confirmation. He gestured for the journal. She passed it to him. He flipped through it, frowning. Feels authentic. It is. He squinted at a specific page. April 12th. New orders from above. Speed increased. We've passed multiple ice warnings. No deviation. Officers seem tense. I heard a crewman whisper something about a drill being canceled. Some say they're replanning something. All I know is this. We're running towards something, not away from it. And it's not just ice in the water. Lucien closed the journal. I've made dozens of dives, he said. I've seen wrecks twisted by war, sabotage, storms, and rust. But the Titanic, there's something deliberate about it. Something too convenient. I always thought that. Evelyn stared out across the black ocean. What if the story we've been told was the cover-up? She murmured. What if the sinking wasn't a tragedy, but a strategy?
She remembered something else from the archives. A letter from J.P., Morgan financier, industrialist, owner of the International Mercantile Marine Company, which held controlling interest in the White Star Line. Morgan had booked a passage on the Titanic, then at the last minute, canceled. He wasn't the only one. Several other high-profile passengers, all connected to American railroad monopolies or European shipping alliances, had similarly withdrawn days before sailing. Officially due to illness or business. Unofficially, maybe they'd have been warned. Later that night, Evelyn cataloged each reference in the journal and matched it against known data. Timelines fit, crew assignments aligned, but the most damning entry came last. April 14th. We've struck something. They were saying ice, but the impact was too sharp, too direct. I was in the lower corridor. I felt it not like a glancing blow, more like a punch, centered. Some of the boys are saying they heard a noise before the collision. A boom, a mechanical detonation. I don't know what's real anymore. I'm hiding this journal in the officers' quarters, under the brass cabinet beside the water pipe. If anyone ever finds it, know this. The ship that sank wasn't the one on the posters, and I think we were meant to go down. Evelyn set the journal down as the waves outside began to rise. She had come here for evidence. Now she had something else, a confession, not just from a forgotten crewman, but from the ocean itself. Chapter 3, The Forgotten Witness. Edwin James Finch had vanished without a trace in 1912. Officially, he didn't exist. His name was absent from the Titanic's crew list. No obituary, no grave, no family listed among the claimants who petitioned White Star Line in the aftermath. Not even a single mention in the exhaustive 1912 British Wreck Commission inquiry. But Evelyn Cross was nothing if not persistent.
People don't just vanish, not completely. They leave traces, misfiled documents, census records, property deeds, voter rolls, ghosts in the bureaucracy, and Evelyn was determined to chase Finch's ghost to the ends of the earth.
She began with what she had: a full name, a likely age bracket, early 20s, and the final self-reference from the journal dated April 14, 1912. That and a short list of locations mentioned Belfast, Queenstown, Southampton. But the break came from an unexpected place. Lucien, watching her trawl the digital archives aboard Narrated, leaned over with a suggestion.
You ever check the Canadian census? Halifax took in hundreds of Titanic bodies. Maybe someone slipped through. Evelyn blinked. She hadn't. She searched the 1921 Canadian National Census, and there, in faded cursive on a scanned return from Nova Scotia, Edward J. Fisher, laborer 33, Belfast-born, arrived 1912. No immigration ship listed, no employer recorded, just the phrase, private transfer. It was thin, but close. Then she cross-referenced that name through Halifax city registries. She found a marriage certificate from 1925. Edward James Fisher married Margaret Wells. One child, Jonathan Fisher, born 1926, and Jonathan Fisher's daughter, still alive, living in Lunenburg, Nova Scotia. 3 days later, Evelyn stood on the steps of a weather-worn seaside cottage. The Atlantic was visible from the front porch, gray and calm. She knocked twice. The door opened slowly. A woman in her early 70s peered out, dressed in flannel, silver hair tied back. She looked Evelyn up and down with mild suspicion, but not hostility. Yes? Miss Fisher? My name is Evelyn Cross. I'm a maritime historian. I believe your grandfather might have worked aboard the Titanic, or what we thought was the Titanic. The woman's eyes narrowed. My grandfather didn't work on the Titanic. She began to close the door. Evelyn gently held out the journal, protected in a sealed archival case. I believe his real name was Edwin James Finch. There was a long pause. Then, slowly, the door opened again.
The living room smelled of pine and old books. Photos lined the walls: fishermen, ships, children on rocky beaches. Miss Fisher, now seated with tea cooling on the table beside her, didn't speak for nearly 5 minutes. When she did, her voice was low. My father told me stories, she said. He said his father came across the sea in 1912, but never said how. Just that it was supposed to be his burial, that he'd survived something no one else should have. Evelyn leaned forward. Did he ever mention the name Finch? No, but he always called himself a man with 2 names. He said the ocean took the first one. Finch had faked his death, hidden in plain sight for decades. Ms. Fisher disappeared briefly into a back room, returning with a weathered wooden box. Inside were faded letters, an old cigarette tin, and a wax-sealed envelope yellowed with age. I was told never to open it, she said. It was for someone who could prove they knew what really happened. Evelyn's fingers trembled as she broke the seal. Inside was a single page, dated 1953. To whomever finds this, I didn't die in 1912, but I buried the name that did. I was below deck when we struck. I survived by luck and by bribes. There was no iceberg. Not the way they said. Something inside the ship gave out. I felt the shudder, heard the explosion. They told us to say it was ice. They bought silence with threats and silence again with distance. They paid for me to disappear, then they forgot me. But the ship that sank wasn't built to survive. It was the Olympic. I worked on her first. I knew her sounds, her scars. I knew what she was. Tell them. Tell them if you ever find proof.
Evelyn sat back, her breath shallow. The words felt heavier than the paper. This wasn't a theory. It was a confession. Finch had lived a full life to the sinking, but he'd never been able to tell his story. The weight of what he knew had never left him. Lothmorth.
Returning to Halifax, Evelyn visited the Maritime Heritage Museum. There, using access granted through her university ID, she cross-checked historical dry dock schematics and payroll records under both Finch and Fisher. A single entry from April 3, 1912 showed an E. Finch transferred from Olympic's repair crew to Titanic's preparation crew in Belfast. Another record from May 1912 2 weeks after the sinking showed an anonymous wire transfer to a bank in Nova Scotia from an account under White Star Line's legal department, _score, score. That night aboard Narrated, Evelyn laid everything out in front of Lucien. The journal, the sealed letter, the dry dock records. He took it all in quietly.
This doesn't just rewrite history, he said. It blows a hole in it. Evelyn nodded. If the Olympic was passed off as Titanic, it's the greatest maritime fraud in history. And if Finch was paid to vanish, how many others were? Lucien exhaled sharply. And who orchestrated it? They both turned to the sonar console. A ping echoed through the room, slow, rhythmic. A signal from the wreck site. Tomorrow's dive would take them closer to Hold 3, where Finch said the unregistered cargo was stored. If they could locate the sealed section of the cargo bay, it might contain the final piece. Not just evidence of the switch, but a motive. More.
Some say the ocean keeps secrets, that its depth isn't just pressure and salt and darkness, but memory. Evelyn didn't believe that. Not really. But tonight she began to wonder. What if the Titanic never sank? What if it was the Olympic that died? And what if the truth was deliberately entombed beneath 12,000 feet of history, sealed not by rust, but by intent? Chapter 4, Beyond the Iceberg. 12,000 feet beneath the Atlantic, light has no meaning. The water there isn't just cold, it's crushing. At those depths, pressure turns steel brittle. Time distorts. Sound carries like memory. And somewhere in that abyss, in the torn open belly of a ship history calls the Titanic, lies a secret entombed in silt, brass, and carefully orchestrated silence. Alethea descended in silence, its twin floodlights cutting a path through liquid night. Inside, Evelyn Cross sat strapped beside Lucien, her eyes locked on the live monitor feed. They were headed for Hold 3.
This was it. The cargo bay Finch had written about in his journal. The location of unlisted crates, sealed vaults, and British naval personnel who'd supervised their loading under cover of darkness. What had they put aboard this ship? What had they tried to bury in the Atlantic?
The debris field around Hold 3 was severe. The hull plating had ruptured inward, not outward, odd for a vessel supposedly torn open by an iceberg scraping along the side. Lucien pointed to the damage.
Look at the direction of the metal, he said. This isn't lateral tearing. It's radial. An internal explosion, Evelyn murmured. Possibly more than one. She leaned closer to the screen, noting blackened scoring patterns along the steel. Burn marks, inconsistent with coal fires or mechanical friction. It looked deliberate, targeted. What was in those vaults?
Alethea hovered near a collapsed section of plating, where the remnants of a bulkhead had crumpled over a stacked array of boxes. Most were unmarked, the contents long disintegrated. But 3 remained intact, reinforced metal crates, sealed, bolted. One bore a scorched stenciled label, Mod Admiralty 1912, Do Not Tamper.
Lucien whistled. Naval issue. That's military freight. They claimed this ship was civilian, Evelyn said. No weapons, no cargo of strategic value. She shook her head. They lied. They lied.
Lucien guided the manipulator toward the closest crate, brushing away silt and rust flakes. The casing was intact, remarkably so. It had been built to survive pressure, temperature, and impact. Designed not for safety, but for secrecy. They extracted it carefully and secured it in Alethea's exterior cargo net. Then they moved to the second box. This one had fractured. As the camera zoomed in, Evelyn leaned forward, her pulse rising. Inside, small cylinders now broken wrapped in degraded canvas. Some were leaking, others had shattered. But even in ruin, their design was unmistakable. Canisters. Military explosive.
This wasn't cargo, it was ordnance. Finch hadn't been imagining things. Whatever sank this ship had come from the inside.
Do you know what this means? Evelyn asked, her voice hollow. Lucien nodded slowly. They were transporting weapons. Experimental, she added. Unregistered, maybe unstable, and they put them aboard a passenger liner. Evelyn's mind raced. In the months before Titanic's departure, tensions had been escalating between Britain and Germany. Naval races, espionage, colonial skirmishes. Was the Olympic masquerading as Titanic being used as a covert weapons transport? Had something gone wrong? Had someone made it go wrong? The submersible began to drift. A subtle current pulled at Alethea, not enough to threaten them, but enough to kick up sediment and obscure the feed. Lucian compensated, adjusting thrusters. Then the sonar chimed 3 slow pings. Unusual, not system diagnostics. Someone's nearby, Lucian said, checking the feed. Another sub.
Impossible, Evelyn said. We didn't log this mission with any public registry. We were in a blackout zone. But then the camera caught it. A shape. Another submersible, larger, older, positioned 200 meters off their stern. No lights, no markings.
Lucian tried a ping. No response. Then the shadow reversed thrusters and sank slowly into the darkness out of view. Military model, Lucian muttered. Could be NATO, or something else. Evelyn stared at the black water. Someone's watching. She remembered an old interview she'd read in a forgotten maritime journal. An engineer on the first Titanic dive in 1986 had mentioned seeing unmarked objects near Hold 3. He'd been cut from the documentary. His footage had been seized for security review. She'd thought it an embellishment. Now, she wasn't so sure. They returned to the surface at dawn, waves calm, skies steel gray. On deck, the crew helped unload the intact crate. Evelyn supervised the transfer to the secure hold. The fractured box, too damaged for retrieval, was left below but not forgotten. Lucian turned to her, sweat still damp on his brow.
That crate you brought up, it changes everything. You realize that? Evelyn nodded. It proves the Titanic, if that's what it even was used for military transport, illegally, during peacetime. Which explains why they needed a scapegoat, Lucian added, and why they were willing to sink a ship full of civilians.
She added it all up in her head. A damaged Olympic, an insurance crisis, secret military cargo, a cover-up masked as tragedy, and a single surviving witness Finch paid to vanish, except the one missing piece. Who gave the order, and who still wanted it buried?
That night, Evelyn paced the corridors of Narrated, mind too alive to sleep. In her cabin, she laid out the journal beside archival images of the wreck, sonar overlays, and the recovered crate's markings. She pulled up the ship's passenger manifest again. Not the official one, but a leaked version. And there it was. Passenger First Class Mr. H. L. Morrow, Legal Counsel, White Star Line. A name that had surfaced before. Henry L. Morrow, now a retired lawyer in London. Descendant of the same man who had once supervised internal claims after the sinking, and who had, according to financial records, signed off on the mysterious transfer of funds to Canada in May 1912. Finch payment.
Evelyn stared out the porthole into the gray fog beyond. The ocean had spoken. It had yielded a box, a journal, a confession. But the real war, she knew, wasn't at the bottom of the sea. It was back on land. It was in boardrooms, in archives, in government vaults, and it was still very much alive. Chapter 5, Misdirection and Motive. If the ocean held the wreckage, London held the lies. The documents, the sealed testimonies, the naval contracts, the silence. Evelyn Cross stepped into the grand lobby of the Albion Private Members Club just after midday. The rain had followed her from Heathrow, drumming against the stained glass windows like impatient fingers tapping out a code. She hadn't been invited, but she knew Henry L. Morrow would be there. He lunched at the same table every Tuesday, a habit cultivated over 40 years of legal and political maneuvering, long after his White Star connections had faded into obscurity, at least on paper.
Some ghosts wore suits.
She spotted him at a corner table beneath a brass chandelier, still broad-shouldered, with a distinguished air that masked the rot beneath. A silver-tipped cane rested beside his chair, untouched. She approached.
Mr. Morrow? He glanced up, eyes sharp. I'm afraid this is a private club. I'm not here for the club, she replied. I'm here for your grandfather. The eyes narrowed. And who might you be? Evelyn Cross, historian. I've been reading up on Edwin Finch. The silence that followed was thick enough to spread with a knife.
Finch is dead, Morrow said, voice low. And so is your theory. She didn't sit. She opened her satchel and placed 3 items on the white linen tablecloth. Finch's journal, the scanned dry dock repair order for Olympic, and the Admiralty crate stenciled serial number printed from the footage. Henry didn't touch them. Do you want to know what I believe, Mr. Morrow? Evelyn asked. No, he replied. But you were going to tell me anyway.
You knew the Olympic couldn't pass inspections after the Hawk collision. She was warped. She listed slightly to port. Repairs wouldn't hold under stress. She tapped the journal. You knew she was a loss. But Titanic, still pristine, was fully insured. Olympic wasn't T. She tapped the scan of the hull number mismatch, and you knew that if you swapped the nameplates, swapped the interiors, most people wouldn't notice. And the passengers? He asked. The crew? They were collateral. Morrow leaned back. You were wasting your breath. No one will believe you. Your evidence is circumstantial. Your witness is dead, and your recovered crate? He smiled faintly. We'll never make it to customs.
That caught her off guard. You've already moved against us? No, Miss Cross. I didn't have to. You sailed into a protected wreck site. That crate is under maritime salvage dispute. It will be intercepted. Probably already has been.
You buried over 1,000 people to protect a shipping line, she said. Morrow's smile vanished. No, he replied. I buried the truth to prevent war.
He paused, then spoke with the slow cadence of someone who had repeated this story to himself for decades. In 1912, tensions were high. Germany was testing naval routes in the North Sea. Britain was behind in armaments. We needed to move prototypes quickly and quietly. The Admiralty requisitioned space aboard a transatlantic liner. He gestured faintly. The ship, already destined for the seabed, made the most sense. Olympic had value only as a ghost. They orchestrated a story so tragic, so cinematic, no one would question the mechanics of it.
You rigged a ship to explode. You slaughtered civilians. We didn't plant charges, he snapped. We transported volatile materials. That was the deal. It went wrong, not by design, but by necessity.
It was a decision made above us, but my grandfather processed the claims. He saw the orders, he signed the transfers, and he kept it quiet. Morrow nodded, until the day he died. Evelyn gathered the papers. You may have buried Finch, she said. You may have scared off others, but I have the journal, I have the wreck footage, and I have his granddaughter. The story is coming out. Morrow stood now, hands resting on his cane. Then you'd best be careful, Dr. Cross, he said softly, because stories like this don't just end reputations, they end people. She left without another word, stepping back into the London rain. By the time she reached her rented flat, she was soaked and shaking, not from the cold, but from rage, from fear, from the weight of what she now knew. She was no longer dealing with historical ambiguity. She was dealing with a cover-up, a living one. Lucian had arrived that morning with encrypted copies of the submersible footage, all stored on solid-state drives now hidden in 3 separate secure locations. He answered the door with a .38 in his waistband. I saw a car outside the hotel this morning, he said. Same model followed me from the club, Evelyn replied. They both understood what that meant. Someone had eyes on them, and the crate. They worked all night, editing a compressed version of their findings. The hull scans, the explosive scoring, Finch journal scans, the list of inconsistencies between Titanic and Olympic. Lucian edited, Evelyn narrated. They encrypted the file and sent it to 12 trusted journalists in 5 countries. Subject line, the real Titanic, what they hid. But just before they could hit send, the power cut out.
Lucian moved fast, sweeping the room with a flashlight. Evelyn grabbed the encrypted drives. A hum of static filled the air, some kind of signal jammer nearby. A minute later, their satellite phone buzzed once, then went dead. They were not waiting for this to go to press, Lucian said. We need to go underground, Evelyn replied. They weren't just researchers anymore. They were fugitives of the truth.
As they disappeared into the London underground, Evelyn kept Finch's journal tucked beneath her coat. It no longer felt like evidence. It felt like a final breath, a dying man's plea that the world remember what had truly happened that night in 1912, and finally, say its name. Chapter 6. The Shadow of Insurance. Follow the bodies and you find the tragedy. Follow the money and you find the truth. Evelyn Cross had spent years combing through rusted manifests, half-lost engineering schematics, and long-forgotten testimonies. But now, the game had shifted. They weren't just tracking anomalies, they were tracking assets, and Titanic, or Olympic rather, had been an asset of unimaginable value.
And when it sank, someone made a fortune.
Evelyn and Lucian had relocated to a private safe house outside York. a remote cottage run by an anti-surveillance nonprofit Lucian had ties with from his intelligence days. From here, they accessed archives using secured proxies and physical verification codes mailed to decoy addresses. The first stop, Lloyd's of London Marine Insurance Records, 1912. A known tangle of bureaucracy. But buried within layers of obfuscation, two policies stood out. RMS Titanic, insured value 1.5 million, Olympic insured value post-hoc collision 0.
Lucien leaned back in his chair. They wiped the Olympics coverage after the naval accident, he said. That's permanent. Uninsurable. But Titanic, Evelyn said, was covered to the brass knobs. And guess which ship actually sailed?
Following the Titanic's sinking, the White Star Line collected the full payout, not in one lump sum but in a series of staggered settlements from 23 firms, all coordinated through Lloyd's syndicates. Evelyn traced the redistribution paths. Several red flags emerged. Rapid bulk transfers to a holding firm called Maritime Securities Limited. A silent partner listed on the board, John Pierpont Morgan. Transfers days later to the Royal Navy Engineering Initiative.
They didn't just recover the loss, Lucien said. They laundered military RD funding through the Titanic's death.
Next, Evelyn pulled the maritime court case documents. She found something even stranger. The British Board of Trade had rushed through an amendment in early 1912. In cases where registered hull names are reclassified under sister ship designation, registry inspection requirements may be waived at the discretion of the line's chief engineer and board representative.
The law had been changed, silently, quietly, to allow a name swap without reinspection. And the date? March 19, 1912, 17 days before Titanic's departure.
Digging deeper, Evelyn discovered that White Star Line had filed an addendum to Titanic's insurance claim, noting that additional cargo of sensitive technical nature had been lost and was classified under Crown security interests. No list of that cargo was ever made public, but Finch had described it, and they had the footage to prove it.
This wasn't just a fraud, she said. This was a heist.
At 3:17 a.m., a message came through on Lucien's darknet connection. A journalist in Berlin, one of the 12 they'd shared evidence with, sent a warning. My account was accessed, drive destroyed, no proof left, I'm out, be careful, then silence. The next day, a second journalist posted an encrypted message on a data leak forum. Search Royal Collier Manifest, April 8, 1912, Belfast. Evelyn did, and what she found chilled her. A cargo ship, SS Formidine, had offloaded crates marked tactical experimental, not for civilian use, into dry dock storage just hours before Titanic's final preparation. It was logged under Olympic's maintenance manifest. The explosives weren't loaded on Titanic. They were loaded on Olympic, because the ship that set sail was Olympic, and she wasn't built to carry weapons. She was built to sink. Everything had been rerouted, the laws, the logs, the finances, all orchestrated to turn one broken ship into the most profitable disaster in maritime history. Evelyn documented everything. She organized the files into 3 categories. 1. The switch ship construction records, hull discrepancies, engineering notes. 2. The weapon Finch journal, sub footage, Admiralty crate scans. 3. The motive insurance records, military funding, court amendments. Then she printed them, on real paper, in triplicate. She mailed 1 copy to her sister in Scotland, 1 to a safety deposit box in Reykjavik. The last she kept in a fireproof case next to her at all times.
Old school, he said. If they kill me, I want the truth to scatter like ashes.
She reached out to a contact at the Maritime History Foundation, an aging archivist named Julian Greaves. Decades ago, he'd worked on the first restoration efforts of Titanic artifacts recovered from the seabed. He owed Evelyn a favor. When she told him what she'd found, he didn't laugh. He simply said, "Meet me in Belfast."
They arrived 3 days later, rain trailing them like a second shadow. Belfast had changed. The shipyards now housed tech startups and museums, tourism, memorials. But the ghosts were still there. Greaves led them to a sealed archive room beneath the Titanic Belfast Museum. The room, he explained, had been sealed since the mid-1980s. Few knew it existed. Even fewer had keys. Inside were the original steelwork plans for Olympic and Titanic. They laid them side by side. Porthole counts, support beam alignment, hull plating specs. And there, marked in red pencil on the Olympic blueprint, refit 3 Sank with hull 401, March 1912. Hull 401 was Titanic. They copied Titanic's interiors onto Olympic's wounded hull. They swapped the sole and left the scar.
Before they left, Greaves handed Evelyn a folded newspaper clipping, an obituary from 1983. Gerald Evans, shipwright, Harland Wolff, retired 1950. The man had written a sealed confession published posthumously by his daughter. It had been dismissed as the ramblings of a dying man. But one quote stood out. "They told us to paint over the wrong name. I knew it wasn't Titanic, but they paid us more than we'd earn in 10 years. That night, Evelyn looked out across the dry dock, where once the Titanic had stood, silent and magnificent. She now saw a grave, not of metal, but of truth. They lied and profited and killed, but not anymore. Chapter 7, The Race for Speed. Speed was pride. Speed was prestige. Speed was politics. But speed also killed. In April 1912, RMS Titanic left Southampton with the quiet understanding that she would not only arrive in New York, she would arrive early. Faster than Cunard's Lusitania, faster than the official record, and certainly fast enough to deliver her cargo ahead of schedule. But Evelyn Cross no longer believed that had ever been the true goal, because the real reason, she now suspected, had nothing to do with passengers and everything to do with payloads. Evelyn and Lucian sat inside the British Maritime Archives in Kew. A few decades ago, this room had been reserved for shipbuilding historians. Now it was deserted, a graveyard of yellowed engineering journals and half-scanned Admiralty memos. Lucian tapped a key and brought up a report labeled Internal Memo White Star Line, March 1912, to Captain E.J. Smith, subject Performance Benchmarking. It was marked confidential, stamped with the White Star seal, signed by Joseph Bruce Ismay himself.
Captain Smith is advised that RMS Titanic shall, under supervised observation, attempt to exceed prior benchmarks set by RMS Mauritania in regard to full-speed transatlantic passage. Extended boiler operation is to be maintained from day 2 onwards. Coal reserves have been increased accordingly. Military observers will travel under diplomatic confidentiality. Lucian looked up. They ordered Smith to push the engines. And not just for bragging rights, Evelyn murmured. For a test run. For a test run!
Titanic's engine room had 6 forward boilers and 4 aft boilers. At cruising speed, only 5 were used. But Finch, in his journal, had written of excessive heat, overpressurized steam lines, and a permanent haze in the lower decks by the 3rd day. The engines were overworked, strained. Titanic, if that's what the ship even was being pushed beyond safe operational limits. Not a pleasure cruise, she said. A trial. The timeline aligned with a series of informal agreements between the Royal Navy and White Star Line documents Evelyn had unearthed in Belfast, dryly titled Strategic Commercial Contingency Protocols. Buried in the fine print, passenger-class liners deemed suitable for repurposing under wartime conditions may undergo performance assessments during peacetime operations at the discretion of the Admiralty. One name repeated throughout the reports: Commander Reginald Atherley, Naval Liaison to White Star Line, 1911-1913. A name Evelyn hadn't seen until now.
Want to bet he was one of the diplomatic observers on board?
They flew to Portsmouth the next day and met with a Royal Navy historian named Clive Hanbury, who had access to naval rosters not yet digitized. Clive was old-school gray beard, wool vest, and the kind of nicotine-stained fingers that only came from decades spent around decaying paper. When Evelyn showed him Atherley's name, he nodded and left the room. He returned with a battered leather folder stamped "Restricted Eyes Only."
I'm not allowed to share this, but I'm also not required to stop you from reading it aloud.
Atherley's orders dated April 6, 1912. Objective: observe RMS Titanic's transatlantic acceleration and onboard handling of controlled military cargo, designated Parcel A. Assess engine room resilience, command protocol efficiency, and threat response timing in real-time conditions. Destination is not primary concern. Proof of operational endurance is.
They were testing how fast and how far a passenger liner could be militarized. Lucian sat back. They pushed Olympic's damaged frame to breaking point under the name Titanic.
Commander Atherley did not perish in the sinking. He was listed as among the dead. But Evelyn found a shipping record under the name Richard Atherton, same age, same rank, arriving in Halifax 5 days after Titanic went down. A second identity, a second cover-up. They faked his death.
Clean exit, like Finch, just higher up the chain.
That night, Evelyn received a call on her encrypted phone. A woman's voice, no greeting. You were making powerful enemies. Dr. Cross. The sea isn't the only place that buries things. Stop digging, then silence. Lucian immediately ran a trace. The signal bounced through 6 countries before disappearing. He turned to Evelyn, someone with access to military-grade redirection protocols. We were dealing with state actors now.
Let them come.
She sat alone after Lucian went to bed, surrounded by pages, open files, and blinking tabs. The plan had never been about safety, not even about insurance. It had always been about capability. Could a commercial liner covertly deliver arms? Could it survive a direct push across the Atlantic at top speed? Could its military observers vanish if something went wrong?
No, but a switch could be made, and history could be rewritten.
She revisited the wreck footage, the positioning of the tier across hold 3, the evidence of radial stress, not scraping, the scorched paint around the cargo bay, the compressed buckling of steel frames, all consistent with an internal blast. Evelyn enhanced the footage of the damage to the port hull and overlaid it with Titanic's blueprints. Mismatch. But a perfect match to Olympic's known repair dimensions from 1911. She froze the image.
It was never about the iceberg.
By pushing the ship, they had triggered a catastrophic mechanical failure, one made inevitable by Olympic's weakened hull. The volatile cargo did the rest. The sinking wasn't a freak accident. It was a byproduct of arrogance, secrecy, and militarization, and 1,500 lives paid the price. Evelyn thought of the memorials, the museums, the documentaries, all with the same narrative, the iceberg, the tragedy, the doomed romance of hubris and nature, all built on a lie.
And we just kept retelling it. Some.
Evelyn saved the last footage to a new drive. Labeled it, Speed Death Tomorrow, they would return to Nova Scotia. Finch's granddaughter had found something else, a sealed letter. Not from Finch, but addressed to him, from a name neither Evelyn nor Lucian had seen before. Atherley, Chapter 8, The Elusive Switch. Truth doesn't vanish, it just waits for someone to return to the scene. Evelyn Cross stood once more in the shadow of the Harland Wolff shipyard, where over a century ago the Olympic-class liners were born identical, almost. Almost. The air smelled of rust and rain, and the dry dock stood silent, a monument to ambition and perhaps betrayal. She had come back not to revisit the myth, but to shatter it, because now, finally, she had the letter, and the dry dock stood silent.
It had arrived 2 days earlier in Lunenburg, Nova Scotia. Finch's granddaughter had found it tucked inside a hand-carved tobacco box, buried in the base of an old tool chest, sealed in wax, unopened. Addressed in formal script, to Mr. Edwin Finch, confidential, private, not to be opened aboard ship. The signature on the bottom corner stopped Evelyn cold. Our Atherley commander, Reginald Atherley, the Royal Navy liaison who was meant to have died on the Titanic. Lucian sat beside her as she carefully slit the wax and unfolded the brittle paper.
Edwin, we are sailing not aboard RMS Titanic, but aboard Olympic, under reassignment. This is not an error. This is the arrangement made at the highest levels. You were chosen because of your prior work on the Olympic's lower decks. You know its bones. Do not raise questions. Do not resist. You will be compensated for silence. If you were reading this after, if things have gone wrong, understand. The ship was never supposed to survive this journey. But neither were we. You, however, have a chance. You always saw more than you let on. Good luck. A. There it was, the final nail in the coffin. An officer in the Royal Navy had not only confirmed the switch, he'd implied the voyage was designed to fail.
How many knew? How many approved? And how many had profited from the screams of drowning men?
At Harlan Wolff, she met again with Julian Greaves, the archivist who had first led her into the off-books engineering vault beneath the Titanic Belfast Museum. This time they brought measuring equipment, scans, blueprint overlays. Lucian had digitally mapped the wreck's porthole spacing and structural welds using Aletheia's footage. Evelyn carried a set of engineering blueprints signed off in 1911 by the Olympic's lead shipwright. Titanic and Olympic had only one major visible structural difference. Titanic's B-deck promenade was partially enclosed. Olympic's was open. Harlan Wolff had supposedly retrofitted Olympic after Titanic's loss to match her sister's design in tribute. But the wreck's footage showed the open design consistent with Olympic before the claimed retrofit.
You were telling me this wreck never had the enclosed deck to begin with? Lucian nodded. Which means it can be Titanic.
Next, they turned to the rivet spacing on the port side hull. Titanic used 6 rivet clusters along bulkhead seams. Olympic, damaged during her collision with HMS Hawk, was rebuilt with 5 rivet clusters and double-braced lateral supports. The footage from Aletheia confirmed 5 rivet clusters, double-braced supports, Olympic. Evelyn stared at the printout, hands trembling. They didn't even bother to hide it well. They just buried it deep. Or forcibly. As they exited the warehouse, Evelyn spotted a man standing near the dock gates, black coat, hands in pockets, eyes behind sunglasses, despite the clouds. Lucian noticed too.
We've got tails. They left through a side gate and ducked into a service vehicle. Julian drove, white-knuckled and silent. That letter was the red line. We were now dealing with active surveillance. Let them watch. I've got what I need. So tupmalt the strower.
That night, they compiled their final dossier. They now had visual proof from wreckage overlays, matching rivet spacing and porthole configurations, engineering documents from 1911, a first-hand letter from Commander Atherley confirming the switch, Finch's journal, recovered military crate footage. They uploaded encrypted files to global whistleblower archives using triple key authorization. Then Evelyn composed the press statement. For over a century, we have mourned the loss of the RMS Titanic as the world's greatest maritime tragedy. But the truth is darker than we imagined. The ship that sailed was Olympic, damaged, uninsured, and deliberately disguised as Titanic to recover millions in losses and to test military logistics disguised as a civilian voyage. This was not an accident, it was deception. And we now have proof. The ocean buried the bodies, but history buried the truth. We choose to exhume both, or s'more.
Then the screen went black. The laptop powered off. The generator outside sputtered. Cellular signals died. Lucian pulled his backup pistol from the drawer. They've found us. Outside, car doors slammed. Evelyn clutched the letter from Atherley.
I'm not running. Lucian looked at her, then smiled.
Good, because we were not alone. A second voice came over the radio, one of the other journalists. The files had reached the mirror sites. The documents were already being downloaded in 7 countries. Too late to stop.
As the lights returned and the screens blinked back to life, Evelyn watched the headlines scroll across an international leak site. Titanic was Olympic, the secret wreck underneath, a grainy side-by-side overlay of the 2 ships, overlaid proof, the rivets, the deck, the truth. The world was beginning to listen. The cover-up had lasted over a century, but tonight it cracked. Chapter 9, New Discoveries. By dawn, the headlines were everywhere. Was Titanic really Olympic? Explosives on board? Evidence suggests military sabotage. New footage of Titanic wreck questions everything we know. Evelyn Cross became a name overnight. Some called her a genius, others a traitor. Most simply didn't know what to believe. But belief wasn't required anymore, only proof. Some called her a genius. She spent the next 72 hours doing interviews via satellite, blurred backgrounds, voice modulation, emergency Wi-Fi relays. The evidence spoke louder than any theory. Video of the porthole inconsistencies, the rivet spacing, the cargo crate Finch journal, Commander Atherley's sealed letter. Journalists from Berlin, Toronto, and Melbourne began validating the data. Within a week, 5 independent naval historians issued a joint statement. The wreck, historically identified as Titanic, contains clear hallmarks of Olympic's pre-1912 configuration. These findings are credible and deeply concerning, and yet no one from the British government responded. White Star Line, long since dissolved, issued no comment. But someone was watching. On the evening of the 7th day, Evelyn received an email. No header, no subject, just a line of text. "You've opened the wrong door. Let's talk before you walk through it." Attached was a formal invitation from the U.S. National Archives Classified Maritime Division requesting her presence in Washington, D.C. for a private briefing. Lucien paced the room.
It's either a trap or the next piece of the puzzle. Either way, I have to know.
They flew under aliases, arrived at Dulles International. A black SUV collected them. Windows tinted, no logos. They were brought through a side entrance into a secure facility, escorted down 2 levels beneath the main archive. Their handler introduced herself only as Director Helen Stroud.
You've caused quite the mess, Dr. Cross. Fortunately, we like messes. She gestured to a sealed box on the table. Inside is everything the U.S. has on the RMS Titanic or the Olympic. We declassified it this morning. For you, when the cause you knew.
Inside were dozens of files marked Eyes Only and 1912 Naval Interest. But it wasn't the documents that stole Evelyn's breath. It was the photo. A black and white image, blurred but unmistakable, a pressure-sealed canister, oval base, multi-locking ridges, identical to the one recovered in Aletheus footage, except this one had a label, Project Gideon Deep Field Variant, Prototype, classified, bioreactive payload experimental, not to be deployed.
This wasn't just a bomb. No, it was a test, a chemical instability trial.
Stroud explained. In 1911, as part of an Anglo-American initiative, prototypes of reactive atmosphere dispersants were developed, meant to be used in trench warfare to corrode enemy oxygen tanks and munitions in closed environments, highly unstable, unusable in open combat. The prototypes were supposed to be destroyed, but instead, 3 were shipped to Belfast for classified marine transport trials, under the name Project Gideon. Finch's notes had described strange temperatures, pressure fluctuations, and an acrid metallic smell near Hold 3. They hadn't known what they were carrying. One of the prototypes or more detonated during the crossing, triggered not by impact, but by pressure differential or overexposure to heat. The Olympic's compromised hull structure would have exacerbated the instability. It wasn't just an explosion, it was a chemical implosion, designed for enclosed spaces like ship holds, which is why the wreck's lower decks were so cleanly torn. No outward blast, just collapse. It was suicide.
It was sacrifice.
Evelyn sat in silence. 1,500 people hadn't just drowned. They'd been poisoned, crushed, buried alive in a test of a weapon that was never supposed to reach the ocean. She looked at Lucien, whose jaw was clenched.
No one's going to be held accountable, are they? Not after 100 years. Everyone who authorized it is dead. Most records destroyed. And truthfully, our own government had a hand in it. Then the story becomes the reckoning.
Stroud slid one more item across the table. A small envelope. Inside, a photograph. A young man in uniform. Handwritten on the back, E. Finch Halifax, 1913. Alive, free. And beneath it, a note from Commander Atherley. I got him out. He saw too much, but he deserved to live. In the following days, Evelyn returned to the UK. The story now had a name. The Gideon detonation documentaries were greenlit. Parliament raised questions, historians argued, but the evidence couldn't be buried again. The public began to understand. The Titanic tragedy was not a tragedy. It was a military failure, an insurance fraud, a human sacrifice, and the greatest cover-up of the 20th century. One night, weeks later, Evelyn sat by the sea, Finch's journal in her lap, Atherley's letter in her hand. She closed both, pressed them to her chest, not for vindication, but for grief. We failed you, but not anymore. Chapter 10, The Missing Link. Not all ghosts live in the ocean. Some live in old manors, in attics lined with dust and regret, in recordings never meant to be played. Until now. Evelyn Cross and Lucien stood at the edge of a crumbling estate in the hills of Kent, where ivy strangled stone walls and the air carried the scent of ancient wood. The home belonged to Clara Atherley, 78. granddaughter of Commander Reginald Atherley, the man who had coordinated Project Gideon's doomed maritime trial and vanished from official history after 1912. She greeted them without ceremony. She had read the headlines.
I always knew something wasn't right. He never spoke of the war, but he drank like he'd lost it. Inside, the house was silent, clocks ticking out of sync, books stacked in strange, defensive towers. She led them to a locked drawer. Inside was a reel-to-reel tape, marked in pencil. R. Atherley, for whomever finds it, encore.
Lucian threaded the tape into a portable player they'd brought. The old motor whirred, the reel clicked, then a voice, dry, dignified, tired. If you were hearing this, then either I've been found or I've been forgiven. Neither seems likely. My name is Commander Reginald Atherley. I was born in 1870, served under both Crown and Conscience. In 1912, I oversaw the loading and transport of experimental ordnance aboard what the world knows as RMS Titanic. It wasn't Titanic, it was Olympic, and I made sure no one would ever know. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. Clara sat unmoving. We had orders. Test the Gideon prototypes under maritime compression. The Navy wanted to know if the weapon could survive depth and rapid pressure change. No official deployment, just proof of concept. The ship was chosen for one reason. It was already compromised. Olympic's collision with HMS Hawk had left her unstable, uninsurable, but if she went down, no one would question it. So they dressed her as Titanic, boarded passengers, loaded the weapons, and gave me the helm. Boarded passengers. I gave orders to push the engines. We wanted stress data, we needed speed curves, and then something went wrong. Finch, clever bastard, figured it out. He was watching, listening. I gave him a choice: keep quiet and live. I couldn't say the same for myself. The voice faltered. There was a detonation, not an explosion, a collapse, a vacuum that shredded metal and bone. We hadn't tested for salt exposure. The casing dissolved, the payload activated. It was my fault. Gerson. She felt as though she were listening to a man drowned not in water, but in guilt. I survived. Officially, I didn't. The Americans helped me vanish, said I'd done my duty, said if the world knew the truth, it would tear apart naval alliances, destroy trust, spark accusations. I've lived in the silence since, but silence is heavy. She reached out and stopped the tape. Lucian looked at her.
There's more. I know. I just needed a moment.
To anyone still listening, I don't ask forgiveness. I ask understanding. I made a choice, I obeyed, and that obedience cost 1,500 lives. Finch was supposed to be a casualty, but I spared him, because even monsters want to save someone. If Evelyn Cross is hearing this, yes, I read your work, I beg you. Tell the story, all of it, but not to punish the dead. Tell it so the living never forget what happens when men chase power and call it duty. We were not unsinkable, we were unthinkable. Then static. The reel spun to silence. Evelyn sat unmoving. The old man's words settled in her chest like stone. Clara stood, walked over, and placed a small brass item in Evelyn's hand. A nameplate, old, etched, not Titanic, Olympic H401.
They kept it, proof, hidden in plain sight.
That evening they left the manor. Lucian drove in silence. Evelyn stared at the horizon, where sea met sky. She had what she needed: the confession, the records, the wreck, the motive, the method. But more than that, she had the truth. Not polished, not cinematic, just human, fallible, and devastating. The Titanic hadn't sunk because of an iceberg. It had been sacrificed, for a war not yet begun, by men who believed consequences ended in the Atlantic. But the sea, Evelyn now knew, doesn't forget, it just waits. Epilogue: the truth that floated. The sea was calm, as it had been that night over a century ago. No wind, no rain, just the soft hush of waves folding into themselves. Evelyn Cross stood at the edge of the Nova Scotia coastline, where the Atlantic had first returned the dead. And now, finally, it had returned the truth. Behind her, the makeshift memorial crowd gathered: reporters, families of the lost, descendants of the crew, maritime historians, naval officers, survivors of silence. The plaque had just been unveiled: RMS Titanic lost April 15, 1912, also known as RMS Olympic reassigned, in memory of those lost to deception, ambition, and silence. May their names never be traded again.
She didn't feel victorious. There was no joy in being right, just the weight of names, the weight of rivets, the weight of knowing that a truth held beneath the sea for so long had finally floated to the surface.
1 week later, Evelyn sat in a radio studio. No visuals, no graphics, just a microphone and a question.
Dr. Cross, if you could speak to one person from that voyage, just one, who would it be? She didn't hesitate. Edwin Finch.
I'd thank him for seeing, for surviving, for writing it down when he didn't have to, for trusting the future to listen, even when his present tried to silence him. She paused. And to those who still call this fiction, who say it's a conspiracy or a coincidence or just a well-timed documentary release, she leaned in.
Ask yourself why there was ever a need to lie in the first place, and then ask why we let the lie last so long.
Some ships sink once, others sink forever, but the Titanic, the real Titanic, never touched water. It was Olympic that drowned, and in doing so, it carried not just passengers, but the price of hubris. And now, finally, the sea had spoken. The truth had floated, and this time it would not be buried. The end. Thank you for listening. Please subscribe, ring the bell, and tell your friends about my listening library.